Well, good morning. Good morning. This is an interesting day. I only had two students show up in my first class. There's only two of you here so far. Did everyone think I gave them the week off? Or something weird else is weird is going on. But I had a great just informal chit chat with my class, with my students last class. So I can lecture, we can talk about stuff from the class in an informal way. We can talk about your papers, we can talk about, oh my God, there's so much going on in the world. Like, whatever, this is your time. But class has officially begun. We're 5 minutes in. So on the weird chance that today is a two-person day, what do you guys want to focus on?
To grasp.
Perfect. So in that case, what I would do is I'd probably give you just like highlights for the
Hmm.
first few readings and then really spend time on Plantinga because his stuff is the
Okay.
most complicated. But Catherine, what would you like to focus on? You get 50-50 grabs here on time. Awesome. But if I'm going through some of the initial stuff too quickly, please feel free to interrupt me with any questions. All right. So I see two little animal anonymous. I see an anonymous kraken. I like how they're making the animals mythical now. Oh, David, we have a third person. Welcome, welcome. All right. So I have a cat hair in my mouth. We are going to be going through, like I said, the beginning of this week's content. I'm just going to skim over it, right? Especially because I introduced some of these concepts last week in preparation for our half week. So I won't spend too much time going over the de jure de facto distinction again. Welcome, welcome. We have some more people joining us. Yay. Just a two-person day, but that's all right. So with that, right, there's some other sort of interesting introductory things that you're going to want to, pay attention to, especially because they will help us out again when we get to Plantinga. So epistemology, we introduced at the beginning of the quarter, right, as one of the four main areas of philosophy. But as we know, philosophy of religion intersects with all different areas of philosophy, right? Logic, epistemology, metaphysics, right? So religious epistemology this week specifically, right, is focusing on theories of knowledge and justified belief, right, having to do with religious propositions. So any sort of belief, and belief again in terms of epistemology is just a propositional attitude, and I'm going to do my little thing. It doesn't mean like attitude. It means you take a truth functional attitude towards that proposition, right? So if the proposition is God exists, you have a belief about that proposition if you maintain the epistemic attitude that that statement is true or false, right? If you are withholding belief, right, then we're going to say something like agnosticism is occurring there, right? But we're talking about an attitude. You're actually taking a position on whether or not the statement is true or false. And this could be inductive too, right? We can just ascribe a likelihood of truth to it. You don't have to be 100% certain one way or the other, right? But a belief is a propositional attitude. And so here, right, we have been, again, looking so far in this class at arguments for the existence of God, right? And these arguments are meant to establish, again, if they're deductive, hopefully beyond a doubt, right? They're trying to guarantee the truth of the conclusion that God exists. We looked at a number of criticisms, right, made by historical philosophers, right? And some questions that we have ourselves potentially about those, right? And as I mentioned, the sort of landscape of philosophy has taken the same route, right? Like we haven't necessarily come to a super consensus on any of those arguments, right? Cosmological, teleological, ontological, they're all questionable, right? In some sort of way. Then we get to the problem of evil, right? An argument against God's existence. And that was after looking at miracles, which at best gave us inductive reason to think that God exists, right? So again, the switch we're looking at this week is not focusing on knowledge necessarily of whether or not God exists based on some sort of evidence, but instead looking at justified belief, right? And now Alvin Plantinga would like to get us to a kind of justified, right? Because we have lots of beliefs that are justified. Some are going to be more justified than others, right? Depending on the type of support that we have for them. So again, degrees, we want to get as close to knowledge as possible. So for him, he's going to call those warranted beliefs. Okay, so for him, a warranted belief is like as close as you can come to knowledge without evidence for something, right? So it's more than just being justified, right? You are warranted in your belief in that thing, right? And so what he wants to do is not try to prove that God exists beyond a doubt, but he wants to prove that believing in God can be not just justified, but warranted, right? So again, that's like a higher status than just justified belief. Okay, and so he's going to lay out a very complicated argument that is going to involve a lot of terms that I will unpack for you. Most of them are just named after Christian theologians that he loved. Okay, so Thomas Aquinas and John Calvin. Okay, so the Aquinas, the AC model that is often referenced in Plantinga's work is the Aquinas-Calvin model. He's just naming it after the philosophers he likes, right? But what he's doing is he's taking something from their theology. And this is my favorite word. You ready for this one? This is another Latin one. Sensus Divinitatus. Okay, so this is a divine sense, supposedly, that humans could have. He doesn't know that we have this, but he thinks it's reasonable to presume that we could have these things if the type of God postulated by Christianity, right, and the monotheistic traditions, if that God exists, it's very likely that we have something like this to be able to determine, or to be able to sense the divine. So there's a lot to be said about this. We're going to get to it into detail. But my favorite thing about Plantinga is he says that if you are an atheist, if you do not sense the divine, your sensus divinitatis is malfunctioning. Or you are in an environment that is very unfriendly to it functioning properly. Right? So he has lots of reasons to explain why someone would not have this sense. Right? But it's a really fun argument. Okay? So, but this is all in moving that argument in that direction, right? We can't prove beyond a reasonable doubt that God exists. So at best, we can try to show that it is rational, justified, warranted, whatever that special word is that you want to use, right? It gives it like a high status, valuable, right? We want religious belief to be that, right? If we can't have knowledge of it, we at least want to be rational or justified or warranted in maintaining those beliefs. Especially, again, when we lack evidence. Okay, so this is another distinction again between faith and dogma, right? None of the philosophers this week are going to be arguing that dogma is rational, right? So we're at most going to be arguing that it's rational to believe something when you don't have evidence for it. No one's going to be arguing that it's rational to believe in something when you have evidence against it. Okay, all right. So, yes, introductory terminology, right? Very good to look at. But this sort of trend, this switch, started off with what are called the pragmatists in philosophy, right? And so pragmatism is obviously a very practical and pragmatic approach to philosophical uncertainty, right? So pragmatists often emerge when we are like at a crossroads in a philosophical dilemma and none of the existing literature is able to resolve it. Pragmatists come in and say, okay, we need to answer this question to do a thing. So where can we reasonably stop the conversation so we can get the thing done? Right? And so that's what it means to be a pragmatist, is that you don't necessarily always follow the problems to their logical conclusion such that they undermine the whole project, right? You need to figure out what the purpose of that theory or answer is first, right? And then we will resolve it based on whatever lets us use the thing the best, right? So the pragmatic response to this question is to figure out whether or not belief in God is to our benefit, right? Is it pragmatic to believe in God despite a lack of evidence, right? And so this is where we very famously get Pascal's wager, okay? So this is not meant to be an argument to convince anybody to believe in God, right? That's not the point. The point of this is merely to show that if you do have this belief, it could be rational, right, under a model like this. And it's really just a cost-benefit analysis, right? So if any of you are familiar with that sort of reasoning approach, right, the idea is that if you're given a number of options, each option has pros and cons, right? You list out the pros and cons of each option, and then you figure out which option has the least cons or the most pros at the end, right? And so for Pascal, and I do have a little chart of this where is it? On slide 14. Okay, so you can see the 4 options, right? Your 2 options are only whether or not to believe, right? You have to only choose whether or not to believe in God, but there's 4 options because we have to account for the possibility of God both existing in both of those situations, scenarios, or God not existing, right? In both of those scenarios. That's a new word. I like it. It's happening. All right. So that's the idea. Now, here's where I want to invoke my teacher persona with you. I personally do not agree with the way Pascal did his calculation. So I often encourage students to do their own calculus, right? So I want you to fill out the chart yourself if you are so inclined. But if you agree with Pascal, you could fill out the chart pretty simply, which is that if God exists, right? So in that first possible column, we're either dealing with you believing in God or not, in which case, if you believe, of course, Pascal presumes that's an infinite amount of good, right? Because he's presuming that you will be rewarded for your belief in the afterlife. Okay, that's the infinite amount of good part. I don't know if Pascal took religious diversity into account when he made this cost-benefit analysis, because according to most religions, it's not just enough to believe in God, you have to believe in the right God, right? So just believing is not necessarily sufficient. Even if it's necessary, it might not be enough to get you in. I've been watching The Good Place, to get you into the good place, right? So he is presuming, though, it is, and so he fills that spot out with an infinite amount of good. So, of course, the flip side for him is that, of course, if God exists and you don't believe, you're going to be punished, right? Infinite amount of bad. So, again, I encourage you to calculate your own cost-benefit analysis. You might still wind up with the same conclusion as him, right? That it's better to believe than not, right? Again, sort of like betting, right? Taking a risk. Like if I have to, or people sometimes say like, okay, I'll just pray to all the gods, right? Like I'm just going to cover my bases and I'm bound to get one of them right. But that's basically the same attitude, right? It's not necessarily something that makes you believe or actually convinces you, but it might seem like the pragmatic, rational, justified thing to do, right? Given the potential outcomes. All right, so that's Pascal's wager. So I encourage you to take a look at it yourself, see if you come to the same conclusion as him. The next author, Clifford, takes the conversation more towards he tries to make it more meaningful again, right? So not just cost-benefit analysis, let's not just be pragmatic, right? We're not just making bets. There are really high stakes involved. And so he's actually going to make the claim that our beliefs have moral entailment, right? So a lot of people think that when we are judging things right or wrong, right, in terms of ethics and morality, that we are judging people's actions. Clifford's paper is trying to show us that our beliefs, we can judge those as well. Okay, so he's trying to make the case that, look, it's not enough for you to just pick arbitrarily based on, not that a cost-benefit analysis is arbitrary, but it's very self-centered in a way, right? It's about the cost-benefit analysis for you, even if you're being utilitarian. Most of Pascal's reasoning lends towards the individual. Whereas Clifford is making the case that, like, no, again, our beliefs have consequences, right? With the way that we treat others in the world. And so even if you don't act on that belief, right, that belief has a moral value to it, right? And even religious belief in this case is going to have a moral value. And so for him, because of the moral value that beliefs have, right, depending on what they're about. I mean, we can have morally neutral beliefs, I'm sure, right? Like, although I guess it depends, right? If I'm trying to say, oh, this remote is black, but you're like, no, it's blue, and I'm trying to gaslight you, then right? And then even still, even if we disagree, there's a moral weight, right, to my disagreement there. But right, the idea is that our beliefs, at least potentially, can be of moral weight. And so we need to have evidence for them, right? So something like faith is never going to be enough for him, right? There's too much at stake for these types of beliefs, especially religious beliefs, right? To not have evidence for them. Okay, so he's tying it to morals there, right? It's because of the moral aspect of our beliefs that we ought to proportion them to the evidence. Okay. All right, so jumping ahead, then we get into Lara Buchek, right? Who I don't know if I assigned her paper or made it optional, but she is again the one arguing that no, faith can be rational, right? So against what Clifford is saying, like we can be rational in believing things based on faith. And she makes her case by way of an argument by analogy. I think I mentioned this again last week, right? Her analogy is to a romantic relationship. Okay, so if you have faith in a partner that they are monogamous and someone presents you with evidence and says, this is evidence that your partner is or is not cheating, right? One way or the other, it's the evidence that they are or are not. Her point is that if you truly had faith in them, you should not look at the evidence, right? You shouldn't need the evidence to confirm it, because if you did, then you didn't really have faith to begin with. So there's something underlying these arguments about faith, though, which is the idea that having faith is in and of itself some sort of virtuous thing to do, right? And this comes from the idea that it's harder to believe in something without evidence, right? It's easy to believe in things when we have evidence for them. So it takes something greater, right, to be willing to put your confidence and your belief in something when you don't have that evidence, right? So this is why religious individuals will often argue that faith is better, right, than having evidence, right? Anyone can believe in God if they have evidence, but to have faith is somehow this like superior thing that you're able to accomplish, right, despite that lack of evidence. Right? Because like, why are you believing? Why are you having faith in God versus, the flying spaghetti monster? We don't have evidence for either of them, but you don't have faith in both of them, right? So again, right, why is faith given this more virtuous status in certain situations? Okay, and so yeah, do we think that it's ever permissible to have faith? And maybe you're not convinced on the religious side, but then think about Buchek's relationship analogy, right? Is it reasonable to have faith there, or should you always be checking the evidence, right? Some people are going to say that you should always check the evidence, right? That's the more rational thing to do. So think for yourself, what do you think, what is the minimum that you need to be rational or justified in a belief that you have? All right, so this leads us to Plantinga, who's going to take this really radical approach and say, nope, faith is not just rational and justified sometimes it is warranted, meaning that you can have almost full confidence in that belief despite any evidence for it. And he says that there are only certain types of beliefs that this counts for, right? We can't just justify everything in this way. That would be super problematic, right? So he says there's only a certain type of belief that has this sort of justification, and he calls them properly basic beliefs. Okay, so these basic beliefs are the ones that happen to us instantaneously. So they tend to be tied to our phenomenological experience, right? So the examples he uses are things that you remember doing this morning, like eating breakfast or not, or having seen a tree, right? Like if you're looking at a tree and you say, hey, that's a tree, and someone says, prove it, you're going to be like, look, look at the right, like that, right? Some things are just, the word he uses is self-evident, okay, or self-justifying. And he thinks perception is like that. He thinks that our perceptual experiences are self-justifying. That doesn't mean they're perfect, right? And this is where the environment that we're in comes into play. Okay, so this is why being in the right environment is so important, because we are fallible. So even though these properly basic beliefs are self-justifying, right, they're only going to rise to the status of warranted, right? Because remember, they're degrees. So just being justified is not the same as being warranted here, right? So we have these justified beliefs. You're justified in believing you had something for breakfast, right? Even if you turn out to be wrong in that belief, right? You're justified in it because it's based on your experience. That's the most instantly accessible to you, right? That's the quickest way to get that information is just from your memory of it. Or maybe, I don't know, you still have some like, no, I still got some oatmeal in here, something like that, right? But you don't even, right? It's just instantaneously known to you. And maybe you've even had something like this, like where you're sure something has happened and you're like mad about it. And then it turns out it only happened in a dream, right? But you were so sure. Like your body just knew it happened. It knew it was right, even though it happened in your conscious, your subconscious, right? And not in the physical world. You had this awareness, right? This confidence level that is not undermined if you find out it was just dream, because you're like, no, but it did happen to me. Like my brain went through it. Right? So just like that, sort of instantly justifying, even if it hasn't happened in the world, but it only rises to the level of warranted under these other circumstances. And this is where those other two components come in, the sensus divinitatis. And the AC model, which is just, again, he's just naming it after his guys. And basically, this model says, again, just like he inferred the sensus divinitatis from the Abrahamic conception of God, the AC model presumes the same thing. If this type of being existed, then we would live in an environment, friendly to arriving at properly basic beliefs, right? So we would be, if God were the type of God we envision, then God would not put us in a reality where our experiences were constantly false, right? So again, for the most part, our experiences in the physical world are reliable. This is another word associated with Plantinga. He's a reliabilist. So even though our sense experience is fallible, it's reliable, right? It's good most of the time, right? And when it's not good for a reason, right? And that reason is typically because something in our environment is not being friendly to us producing true beliefs, right? Whether we're like in a hall of mirrors, like in a space that is trying to give us optical illusions, whether it's the physical body that I'm using, right, to access my information. Like if I take off my glasses, right, because I require prescription lenses, I am no longer in a friendly environment to trusting my perceptual sight, right? It's the moment I took these off, I changed the environment that I'm getting visual data from, right? So it's no longer friendly to me producing true beliefs, right? So again, it's that subtle. The environment is really important. Okay, so like if you're in a cult and you're having a lot of divine sensations, he's going to say you shouldn't trust that, right? Because you're in a highly manipulatable environment, right? Where someone can control what you experience, right? So again, the environment that you're in is really important. The other side of that that's really important is the sensus divinitatis. And again, he's sort of going on your instinct here. He thinks that it is natural in people. So he must experience something in him himself, and he is a Christian, right? Specifically, he's a Calvinist, right? Because Calvin's one of his dudes. But right, so the idea here is that he physically experiences this, so he is presuming that other people also have this sense as well. And again, he's given an account if you don't, if you don't experience this. But he thinks that there is something in us that senses something beyond the natural, right? Beyond what is in front of us, right? Some people talk about like, being part of something bigger or, right? Just, I don't know. Have any of you had any sort of spiritual experiences you could help? They're often, unable to be put into words. But can anyone, how have you heard people describe, a sense of God? Right? Not based on evidence, not based on any phenomenological, perceptual experience, but just a sense, just a feeling. Surely you've heard people talk about this, right? No? They don't say like, look outside, look at how beautiful, right? Like this couldn't have just, right? I guess we could go back to some of the intelligent design stuff, right? That instinct to look outside and say like, surely you can feel the supernatural, right? Feel that there's something divine, something beyond right? Greater than just the human, greater than just the natural. Yeah. So that sense, he thinks, he has a name for that. He calls it the sensus divinitatis. Okay, so as long as your sensus, you have that, right? You have the sense, which is that initial instinct, right? That's us going to be responding to the presence of the divine in a way that we're not able to access with our perceptions, but we talk about it like a feeling. So maybe this is the sixth sense. The new sixth sense is the sensus divinitatis, right? But you again have to be in the right environment. Now, so what's really interesting about this is Plantinga has to admit that if it turns out that there is no God, all of the people who believe in God are being irrational, right? But the point of his argument is that if it turns out that this God exists, the sense that people have of it is justification enough, right? As long as, again, you're in that proper environment. So properly basic belief is complex, right? He's not going to let any sort of immediate belief or experience count as warranted, but as long as it meets these criteria, right, it can be warranted. And so certain types of religious belief will be warranted in this way. And we will come back to this, I think, are we covering it in this class? Oh, yes, we are in week 9. Oh, next week. Perfect. So this is going to lead us perfectly into religious pluralism and inclusivism, right? So the next reasonable question we might ask someone like Plantinga is, okay, if, I just have this sense that God exists and it's properly basic and I'm not in an environment where anyone's trying to trick me, then why is my belief in, say, a Hindu God any different than someone's belief in, say, an Abrahamic conception of God, right? So how do we deal with the different propositional beliefs that arrive from this properly basic way, right? And so he's going to respond to that. But he's interestingly going to respond that it's still rational to be an exclusivist. So he's going to say that it's rational to think that only your beliefs are justified, not other religious people's. But again, he's going to give us criteria for that. It's not always going to be the case. You have to do certain things in order to be justified in believing that your religion is the right one. And the first one, obviously, is learn about the other religions. Right? You can't go around saying yours is the right one if you haven't even bothered, right, to learn what the competing views are. So again, it's not going to be as bad as it sounds, right? But he is going to give an argument for that exclusive religious belief, right? Even without evidence. So it's quite interesting. Okay. So yeah, that got through a bulk of it without getting into some of the dicey details of Plantinga, but questions so far about anything I've gone over. Then we can dive back into specific figures. How about going back to the pragmatists? Any questions about Pascal? Pascal's wager? No? Okay. How about Clifford? The ethics of belief. This is a tough one. Do you guys think that beliefs have moral value? That a belief, just an attitude towards a proposition, could be right or wrong? For you, it has to be both.
Yeah.
So then my question to you is, could we think of a belief that doesn't... Do we have beliefs that don't affect the way we act in the world? Because that would be a prime example, right? So then can preferences be morally judged? And this is interesting because we're now starting to have these questions about human preferences of other humans, right? Good, right? So we can't necessarily say that the belief that spiders are creepy is inherently wrong, because just because someone believes that doesn't mean that they automatically are going to be aggressive or violent towards them, right? And so this would be a great counterexample. Someone could have that belief and have it not lead to a problematic action, unless you think the E is problematic. Right. But honestly, like I remember being a camp counselor and all the girls were like screaming because there was a mouse. And I'm like, oh my God, calm down. And then I looked over it and I yelled too. It's just, it can be a reaction, you know, it's uncontrollable sometimes. But yeah, right. So maybe not all of our actions or all of our beliefs, even if the belief might be negative, right, need translate into something equally negative. Good. So then maybe we might think that there could be amoral beliefs in that sense. But then, yeah, I want to say that there are plenty of examples of people believing that something is quote unquote creepy and having that lead to really problematic beliefs, right? And then really problematic treatment of whoever is being deemed creepy. So yeah, it's tough because we could look at it both ways. So maybe it's yeah, whether or not it's connected to action, but then yeah, how do we is that just a matter of time, opportunity, right? Like what if someone has a racist belief, but they never happen to come across a black person, right? Like they never have the opportunity to be racist. Yeah, good. So maybe even the spider example, like what if one of these women had, someone really close to them who really loved spiders and now can't share that love with them because right? Like but this is the case, right? So sometimes, other people's reactions or, right, their beliefs about things, they inform the way we approach them, right? And the way we interact with them. Yeah, good, good. Unintended consequences here. So again, no clear answer on this, but something to think about. Do you think that beliefs have moral weight, value, and if so, under what conditions? Yeah, good. And this brings up other interesting analogs to this situation, which have spurned a whole new area of philosophy, the philosophy of comedy and humor, right? Like, is a joke funny? Is it morally permissible to laugh at a joke? Does it depend on who's saying the joke? Does it depend on who's laughing, right? Like, all of these things, they seem so context dependent, right? Like if the situation were reversed, obviously, right, problematic. We've seen it so much throughout history, but because of that history, it sort of makes the inverse okay, right? Or in fact, maybe good, right? That there are places that are safe havens. I know that this is often lamented by gay friends of mine, like how all the straight women fled to the gay bars because they were trying to avoid being sexually harassed, and then they ruined the gay bars for the gay men. like, right? So like people trying to do something that might be good for them and people around them is not always good for other people, right? And while we don't want segregation in terms of people, yeah, being discriminated against, at the same time, like those communities where people got to just be with people that were like them, right? Other marginalized folks. If you talk to people, those are valuable spaces to them, right? So yeah, we want integration, but at the same token, we want to also keep spaces for like-minded, lived experienced, right? Sharing types of things. So yeah, it's very, very tricky. Again, philosophy, you're welcome. No clear answers to this. Lots of pondering for us yet to do. Good. And that leads us into, again, right, how much evidence might we seek or not seek, or should we be seeking for these types of things? And, this could again lead to other analogs, I think, to how we interact with each other. A lot of people made this claim about getting off of social media because, oh, I never used to have to know how racist my relatives were. And things like this. Like maybe we just keep some of those, right? Maybe we don't need to look for that evidence. Stoke the flames. Like, oh, what are your views on all of these things? Like that didn't always used to be the case, but right? Again, are there ways of getting around that? Maybe there are. I was just sharing again with my other class. There's Daryl Davis, I think, is the musician's name. There's been a documentary made about him, but there's a lot of stuff about him. But he is a Black R&B musician who has befriended over 200 members of the KKK. And through his friendships with them, have gotten them to leave the Klan. And many of them have actually given over their robes to him, like as a sign of, his victory over the hatred that had been instilled in them, right? And it was not necessarily through confrontation with their beliefs being wrong, right? It was through just being a human with them and just sharing, like working off of other things, right? Letting them come to those realizations on their own. So again, even if you do think that beliefs have a moral value, right, and that we ought to confront people's beliefs who we think are wrong, there's still a matter of how we go about doing that confronting. So he has I highly recommend the documentary about him. I can't recall the name, but I'm sure Google could tell you. But he has this fascinating conversation with a member of Black Lives Matter towards the end of the documentary. And it's about these approaches, right? Very different. One is very much in your face, right? Very antagonistic. And there are pragmatic reasons for that, right? Just like there are pragmatic reasons for his approach. So again, maybe there's no one right answer. There are lots of approaches, but good things to keep in mind when we disagree with each other just on our beliefs, right? How ought we handle that type of disagreement? Okay, and so that leads us back to Plantinga with our remaining 8 minutes left. So again, there's a lot of technical jargon in his work, but just remember those three things. The properly basic belief is what he calls them, right? The types of beliefs that can rise to the level of warranted, but they require those two things, right? Your sensus divinitatus functioning properly, in something like the AC model, which just means, again, a friendly environment, right? You're not being tricked or something like this. Right, so those are his necessary and sufficient conditions for having a religious belief in God rise to the level of a warrant. Right? And so he's going to say that, yeah, if there were lots of people who had what would we call it? Sensus spaghettitatus. Something for sensing the flying spaghetti monster. Like, if people had that, then yeah, we would be having a different conversation, right? But he's going off of the fact that most people, right, in the world that he lives in are believing in a God or something like the Abrahamic conception of God. He's still, again, going to deal with religious diversity. We'll see that next week, right? But he does think that people have religious beliefs for a reason, right? Even though that's not based on evidence, right? It's a certain type of belief that, like these other perceptual beliefs we have, are self-justifying if they meet these criteria. Okay, so it's a big if, but it's an important possibility, right? Because if someone meets that, then they are justified in believing in God without any evidence, right? Such that they basically have knowledge of it. So any questions about his view? Just making sure I covered all of the big things. Yes. Yes. Oh gosh, yeah, I didn't even get to this. So after he talks about the Sensus Divinitatis, he talks about the IIHS, which I don't know why that always sounds like something from a car commercial to me, like your APR financing and IIHS. But no, for him, it's the internal instigation of the Holy Spirit. So when your Sensus Divinitatis is functioning properly, that's the feeling you get. This internal instigation, right? It's an instigated feeling, a presence of the Holy Spirit. So if you were wondering what that is, it's the activation of your Sensus Divinitatis. He would say that one of their Sensus Divinitatis, I don't know what this singular is, that it's malfunctioning for some reason. So I actually have all my books with me. I'll have to get out Warranted Christian Belief. Give a bunch of reasons, possible explanations for why that could be the case, okay. Right? So, and they're very pragmatic explanations, right? Like anecdotally makes sense, right? Like if someone has just grown up with like a really terrible experience with religious affiliation or someone claiming to be a religious authority, right? They might always be skeptical, right, towards religion. And so that trauma may have caused their sensus divinitatis to malfunction. Yeah, things like that. Or again, he's going to say there could be a way in which being in the wrong environment, not the wrong, but an environment that leads you to belief in a different type of God, a God that doesn't happen to exist, or if you are raised in an atheist environment, right? Those could also damage your sensus divinitatis too. Not super charitable explanations. And again, he always says it's something like this. It doesn't have to be that, right? But something we have to give a name to whatever this internal feeling is. So this is what he calls it from Aquinas. Good questions. All right. Well, we have 3 minutes left. Next week, like I said, we're moving into religious pluralism. So we're going to be considering, right, the fact that when it comes to, again, arguments for God, arguments for death, the afterlife, the soul, miracles, all the things we've been talking about, we've been hinting, and maybe more than hinting, at the fact that there's more than one potential God that could be the explanation, right? Definitely many different conceptions of the divine out there. And so we're going to confront ourselves with the question of what is one to make of all of these disparate answers, right, to religious questions, and how ought we view this diversity of thought. Now, it might help for some of you to familiarize yourself with Eastern religions a little bit more. We did this a little bit when we covered the death and the afterlife, right? But it might be good to refresh your memory. So I'm sharing the link there. This is under the gig philosophy, if that link doesn't work sometimes. But it's Eastern philosophies, and there are some good charts in here, specifically towards the bottom. Here's the one I want. Oh, are you even on this page? No, you're not. So it's under Hinduism, probably. Yes. Indian metaphysics. That's where I talks a little bit about the other types of theism, right? Pantheism, panentheism, polytheism, right? Deism. So Hinduism is very inclusivist. There are lots of different ways of conceiving of the divine that are all equally valid. So again, just familiarizing yourself with that might be useful for our religious pluralism conversation next week, right? Because having knowledge of the ways in which the religions differ, right, will help you understand how we can try to reconcile some of those disagreements in a way that might make sense, right? So Hinduism, again, has this really interesting type of dualism, right, where it is basically called qualified dualism, where we can talk about two separate planes of existence, but really there's only one ultimate reality that they all exist within, right? And that is Brahman. But because Brahman is infinite, we can't conceive of it. And so we have to talk about Brahman in bits and pieces. And so this is where we get the many names and personas of Brahman that becomes the Hindu pantheon of millions of gods, right? Is we're just talking about different personalities, parts, attributes of Brahman, but it's all one and the same. But we still have to talk about the illusory physical world that we live in, right? And so that's a very different view of metaphysics and reality than what we get from the Abrahamic religions, right? Where it's not necessarily just dualism like heaven and earth, but potentially there's a third afterlife, maybe a fourth if we're talking about some sort of, what's the one in Judaism where you just wait? Oh, total brain fart. Purgatory, right? So maybe there's even a fourth dimension for, right, the people in between heaven and hell. So there's all different conceptions, right, of reality. Can we say that all of them are partly true, right? What does it actually mean? So you have to decide how much consistency you're going to require between these beliefs before you want to say many of them are true, or only one of them is true, or none of them are true, right? There are lots of different possibilities. So that is what we will be looking at next week. Thank you so much for those of you who are joining us today. I hope you have a great weekend, and I will see you on Tuesday.